In this video, I'm going to continue to talk about World War II, and I'm going to try and explain some of the ways in which it develops. Hopefully we'll make it all the way through, but might take another video just to wrap it all up. We begin towards the autumn of 1941, and up until this point, the Axis powers led by Nazi Germany have been overwhelmingly successful. Now we come to Hitler's invasion of Russia. Hitler's invasion of Russia a little different from some of the other German campaigns of World War II because it's ideologically driven. It's a part of Hitler's plan for the racial superiority of the Germans. To conquer Russia, take advantage of Russian natural resources, in particular all the territory of Russia, and to remove the Russian people from this land. As the idea of Lebensraum, or living space. And so this is part of the dominance of fascism that we've talked about so far. That means that this war is not just a war of conquest, it's also a war of genocide. That even though we never see it fully enacted, it's pretty clear that Hitler planned to drastically reduce, if not totally eliminate, the Slavic peoples in Russia. So this war is going to be much more brutal and much more bitter, even than the huge wars, huge campaigns with great casualties we've seen so far. At the same time, it's also fought on a much greater scale than Western Europe. Basically, for most of the period of the war from this point, the rest of the war from this point, you're going to find double the number of men and double the number of armies and double the number of tanks and planes fighting in the battle between Russia and Germany than you will between Germany and the other Allied powers. So it's a huge theater in which the conflict is very bitter. Initially, the German army sees the same successes using its blitzkrieg tactics that it's seen throughout the rest of the war. And the Russian army, after Stalin's purges, has very few experienced officers and is caught unprepared. Nevertheless, Russia is such a huge country that Stalin is able to put his people to work in moving the industries. It's amazing. They deconstruct entire factories and move them deeper into Russia, out of the way of German invasion, where they can continue to produce the war materials that the Russian army needs. Added to that, the Russian army has huge reserves of manpower that they can call upon. So even though the Germans are enjoying these huge victories at the beginning of the war, they're not enough to knock the Russians out. And the Russian winter comes before they can seize the Russian cities that are kind of on the edge of the most populated part of Russia, a point where Russia might surrender. If the Germans had managed to conquer Moscow or Leningrad, Stalingrad in that first winter, you might have seen a different outcome to the war. You might have seen the Russians being willing to negotiate peace. But in fact, the winter comes too early for the Germans. In fact, they had delayed the invasion about 2 weeks to put down a rebellion in Yugoslavia, which they did with great brutality. Some historians have speculated that if they hadn't done that, they might well have achieved Hitler's victory objectives for the first year of the war, which was the conquest of Moscow, greater control of Western Russia. But as it is, the Russians can survive, and during the winter, when it's too cold, so it's so cold that the German jet fuel freezes, or the German airplane fuel freezes, and the Germans don't have their air supremacy, and the Russians can kind of roll back German advances just a little bit. At the same time, as we come to the winter of 1941, the Japanese, faced with growing tensions with the United States of America, faced with the choice of either giving up their conquests in the Pacific or going to war with the Americans, choose war and hope to establish a Pacific perimeter, or a Pacific rim, if you like, from which they can fight a strategic defensive battle or a defensive campaign. But to do this, they have to knock out the US Pacific Fleet. And so they attempt to launch a surprise attack on the United States Pacific Fleet in Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. And the attack is a total surprise, in large part because the Japanese had not declared war by this point. So this came as a total surprise. This was seen very much as a war crime by many observers, that the Japanese simply attacked the Americans. And we have these accounts about how they were trying to coordinate the declaration of war with the attack on Pearl Harbor, but in the end, the attack comes without any warning on the Americans. And so the attack is quite successful, but kind of like the German invasion of Russia, it's not conclusive. And even though the United States has suffered a severe loss, it's not a catastrophic loss. Most importantly, their aircraft carriers survived the attack. Nevertheless, in the months after Pearl Harbor, in the first 6 months or so of 1942, the Japanese continue to be successful and continue to sweep through the Pacific, seizing British, Dutch holdings, seizing the Philippines, even attempting to attack Australia, and only just turned back by the Americans. But then, midway through 1942, the Americans win a great victory at the Battle of Midway. And this is very much a turning point in the war. What's interesting about the war in the Pacific is that it reveals the way in which war is changing during this period. And the way that war is changing is that it's becoming more remote. And we see this with naval warfare and the growing importance of the aircraft carrier. So from now on, you're not so much going to see battleships lined up against one another and firing guns at each other as we've seen in naval warfare ever since the beginning of this class. Instead, you are going to see remote attacks being launched from aircraft carriers, and that destroying aircraft carriers is going to become the most important aspect of fighting a naval battle. And in the Battle of Midway, the Americans are able to destroy 4 Japanese aircraft carriers. And not only is this a victory for the United States, it also buys them time. It also buys them time to put their economy on a war footing and then just go after the Japanese. And the Japanese strategy for success was based on the idea that they could win a quick victory, force the United States to negotiate peace, and could go on ruling their empire in the Pacific. They knew that if the United States got a footing in the war, that they would always be outproduced. And this is exactly what happens. Basically, from the Battle of Midway onwards, the Americans are always producing more and better guns, planes, boats than the Japanese. More men even as well. And so from this point onwards, the American military effort is going to outpace the Japanese and eventually overwhelm them. And this is only going to be possible, or at least we don't know what was only possible, but we know that the Battle of Midway made this possible. And as we come to the end of 1942 and into 1943, we see that the tide of the war is turning. The British win an important victory over the Germans in North Africa, the Battle of El Alamein, which marks the point at which they secure control of the Suez Canal. Remember in the last video I talked about how vital this is to the continued ability of Britain to sustain a war effort, and secures British territory in Egypt. Then in Russia, at the Battle of Stalingrad, the Germans attempt to take the city that will give them access to the Caucasus, the Russian oil fields, will cut the Russians off from their oil supply. It's a city that bears Stalin's name. Hitler badly wants to capture it, and they come very close, but they get dragged deeper and deeper into this battle to take control of the city, and then other Russian armies come up and encircle them, and the whole German army gets destroyed. And these, again, are men and soldiers that the Germans can't afford to lose. When they lose another battle, the Battle of Kursk, the following summer, the Soviets from now on are going to be in control of the Russian front of this war. The Battle of Kursk is interesting because it's the largest tank battle in history. You had thousands of tanks on either side. It's also interesting because it's the first time the Russians have won a victory that wasn't during the winter. So before this point, the Germans were always successful during the summer, and then the winter came, and the Russians were able to roll back their advances and their successes. The Battle of Kursk marks the first time that the Russians are able to win a victory during the warmer months, and from this point onwards, they are going to control the passage of the war on the Eastern Front. I'm going to provide one more video, so I'm going to bring this one to a close here. I'm going to provide one more video that kind of ties everything together at the end of World War II.